Today we are continuing on in our sermon series titled Vanishing Grace. And we're asking the question, is there something better? Is there something better? How many of us think that the world is getting better? Anybody? A few hands. All right, I'm not going to throw up a poll that you have to text in or anything, but there was a few hands that were raised. Generally speaking, some of us think that the world is getting better. I mean, after all, there's cell phones now, there's internet, there's safer transportation, there's improved medicine and medical treatments. But as we saw, not too many people raise their hands because in some ways the world is getting worse. You know, we seem to have much more social strife, social issues. There seems to be a lot more corruption. There seems to be more diseases, more illnesses, and there seems to be more violence and more danger in this world. And with that in mind, here's a snapshot kind of how things that are going on currently in America. 73% of Americans say our moral values are worsening. In the past few decades, teenage suicide has doubled, violent crime has tripled. Well, thankfully, it seems to be tailored off in the past couple years, but it's still quite a large increase. With 5% of the world's population, Americans have almost 25% of the world's prisoners. We have become experts in incarceration. And the leading causes of death are self-inflicted. Whether it's drugs, alcohol, tobacco, obesity, sexually transmitted diseases. And with all of this going on, the politicians, our government, doesn't seem to be doing much about it. They're more deadlocked now than they ever have been. And so we have this view that these statistics that kind of show that society, that our country, or the world is declining. And it's interesting to note that there's a correlation, perhaps, between the increase of these negative statistics with the decrease of religious observance and religious attendance. Now, I know statisticians are quick to point out that correlation does not equal causation, and so probably, the lack of church or religious observance doesn't make a huge impact or make an impact in all of these things. But I think there's a connection there that the less and less people are open to religion, are open to God, the worse the world seems to be getting. And yet, despite all of that, more and more people have a negative view of religion. More and more people believe that there is something better that they can be doing with their time than spending a few hours every weekend at church. They think that there's something better out there than gathering together with an organization of believers. And people just have this opinion that there is something much better, much bigger out there than God and better than His grace. But Jesus says that this is not how people should think. They should understand that the church is here to make a difference, that there's an importance to religious observance. There's an importance to being a part of a community that gathers together to worship and to believe and to increase in each other's faith. That the church is here to make a difference in the community, to make a positive impact in the world around them. Jesus tells this parable. He tells a story in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, starting with verse 31. Jesus told another story. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man planted in his field. That seed is the smallest of all seeds, but when it grows, it is one of the largest garden plants. It becomes big enough for the wild birds to come and build nests in its branches." A lot of times, Christians apply this concept of the mustard seed to their own internal faith. And I think that's another thing that Jesus said, that our faith grows like a mustard seed. But here Jesus is saying that the kingdom of God, the outward expression of our faith, starts as something small, but it becomes big and it continues to grow until it makes a difference, until it makes an impact in the world around us, until it provides a benefit for the world around us, until the birds are willing to come and eager to come to build their nests within this kingdom of God. To make it even more clear, in verse 32 he continues, or verse 33 rather, Jesus tells another story. He says, the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and hid in a large tub of flour until it made all the dough rise. Jesus is saying that the kingdom of God, that the organization of his believers are to make a difference in the world. It's supposed to raise the world, elevate the world, make an impact, a positive impact in the community and the world around us. This is our calling as Christians. But grace is vanishing in this world because Christians have not convinced the world that God's grace is the best thing there is. We as Christians have fallen short in letting the world know and convincing the world that they can stop looking for something else, that there is nothing better out there, that there's nothing available, no matter what the commercials on TV might say, no matter what the whispers that Satan might give, there's nothing better in this world than God's grace. This is the message that they need to hear. But so often, people think that Christianity, that the Christian church doesn't make a difference. In fact, makes a negative difference in the world. But that hasn't been our history. Even though right now a lot of people like to highlight the shortcomings that we as a religion have had in our history, at the beginning of Christianity, we were known for making a wonderful, beneficial impact in our society, in our culture, in our world. The early Christian church, early Christianity was known for rescuing the babies that had been abandoned on the streets of Rome. They were known for playing an instrumental part in putting an end to the violent gladiatorial games. They were known for feeding the people that were hungry. They were known for caring for the sick, not only caring for those that had minor things like colds or flus or whatnot, but they were known for going into places where there had been a deadly outbreak of a disease or an illness and caring for those that needed comfort, often at the cost of their own lives. And 99% of the people that the early Christians helped were not Christians. They were just other people that were in need of experiencing God's grace, of experiencing the truth that there is nothing better than God's grace. And in fact, it wasn't just the early Christians. Part of our Protestant heritage is this: in that areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are on average more economically developed today, with better health, lower infant mortality, greater literacy, and higher rates of gender equality. That places where Protestant missionaries had gone and had been there for a while had changed the world around them for the better. And yes, looking back on it, they probably could have done things a little better. If they had gone in with a modern sociological understanding of culture and the different demands and the impact, they probably could have made things a bit better. But they did the best they could. And they've had a lasting, beneficial impact on the world that they changed, on the countries that they changed. And sometimes critics will point to countries like Denmark and its Scandinavian neighbors and say, well, look, these countries, they have a high quality of life and 90% or more of them aren't Christian. How do you explain that? Well, the truth is they were Christian at one point. Before Christianity came to their shores, there was just a bunch of warring and pillaging Vikings. But then they got yeasted and salted with Christianity. And the truth is that once a culture is yeasted and salted, it's hard to become unyeasted and unsalted. You can't really remove yeast out of dough. Have you ever tried? Not too easy to do. In fact, organizations that study the impact or that rank different countries around the world in various categories, they consistently show that countries that identify as Christians always rank in the top of the rankings when it comes to freedom, when it comes to lack of corruption, and when it comes to the greatness of gender equality. Country after country that identifies as Christian is always at the top of the charts, top 10 when it comes to these countries' rankings. Christianity has made a positive impact in the course of the history of these countries, of these nations around the world. And yes, we have made mistakes in our history. Some of the darkest points in our history were the Crusades that Christians engaged with against the Muslims and the Holy Land. And yet, despite our shortcomings, despite the mistakes we have done, despite the horrible things that have happened in our life, in our history, we have a history of making a positive, beneficial impact. And yet, grace is vanishing because Christians have not convinced the world that God's grace is the best thing there is. We have continued to let the world think that there's something else, there's something better, that our message of God's grace can come in second to other things. But even though the world isn't convinced of the goodness and the greatness of God's grace, they still have the big, deep questions. Every month, 250,000 Americans type in to Google the question, what is the meaning of life? 250,000 people every month question Google. Just here in the United States, what is the purpose of life? Why am I here? We continue to have these deep philosophical questions. These kind of questions are hardwired into human psyche. That is why you find religion in pretty much every corner of the world. People have gathered together to try to answer these questions. And yes, religions differ on the answers to these big questions. But people continue to ask these questions despite rejecting religion or organized Christianity. And some of the substitutes that our society has come up with for the gospel of grace is science. That's one of the things that people are quick to replace grace with, quick to replace faith with, is verifiable data that they can believe and that they can see is true or not, as opposed to a God that may or may not be there. And I had a series about this last year, so I won't rehash any of that. If you want, you can go look at our YouTube channel and see those sermons. But the truth is, science does not answer every question that we have as humans. Science comes up short from time to time when it comes to answering these deep questions that we all have. For example, the butterfly cocoon. Science has no explanation for why it is beautiful. There's no reason for something like that to have any kind of beauty. It's just there to function. And, it could be gray, it could be brown, and yet we frequently see these cocoons are gorgeous. Someone has said that scientists have said everything that can be counted does not necessarily count. Everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. Everything that's important doesn't necessarily have some verifiable data attached. And even though you can dig into data for some things, that doesn't make them important. Beauty, you can't really quantify beauty through scientific research. And yet, beauty is something that's important to pretty much all of us. And science also comes up short when it comes to explaining morality. Science, the best it can do is say that we were born with a selfish gene, that everything that we do is out of self-preservation. And yet it doesn't explain altruism. Why do people do things just for the sake of doing good? Why do people help others when it costs them and it has no benefit for them? Charles Darwin said, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution or reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seem to him the best ones." He's saying if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe that there's a God out there that's offering grace and salvation, then what you're left with is just doing whatever feels good to you, whatever is the strongest impulse and desire that you have. He says there's no basis for morality. A second substitute for the gospel of grace is success. We see this in our culture, maybe now more than ever, that we live in a culture that celebrates celebrity, that celebrates wealth and sex and success and power. The world tells us that all we're here for on this earth is to laugh and to have a lot of money and to be good at our jobs and to look good in a swimsuit. And yet, this success comes up short. This message that the world has for us, it doesn't really meet the deep, profound needs that we have. Because media has so infiltrated our culture, that media is so connected to success, whether it's the media of movies and TV, that those are just illusions. You know, that we don't get to walk around with makeup, and we don't get to have fancy houses that are really just facades. We don't get to experience big action sequences that are 90% CGI. You know, that's all just an illusion. And same thing with social media even. Most of the stuff we see on social media is an illusion, because you see people posting pictures of their wonderful vacations, but you don't see them tearing their hair out at work, right? We see that the success in our culture is very much an illusion. It doesn't satisfy. The main emotion of the adult American, says John Cheever, an American author, the main emotion for us that have all of the advantages of wealth, education, and culture is disappointment. We've bought into this idea that success really itches or scratches our deepest itch, and yet at the end of the day, despite all of it, despite all of the advantages we have, we're left with disappointment. And this is what Jesus was talking about. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verse 36, he asked, "And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul?" It doesn't matter if you have all of if you've been able to check all of the boxes that the world says that we should check. It doesn't matter if we're rich and famous and successful and beautiful. It doesn't matter if we obtain all of that and still lose our own soul. Because that stuff, it doesn't really satisfy. And the third substitute for the gospel of grace is moralistic therapeutic deism. Again, that's something I've referenced in previous sermons, but basically it's a long mouthful to say people come along and they pick and choose what they want to do, what they want to believe in. They'll take a little bit from the Bible, they'll take a little bit from the Quran, they'll take a little bit from the Bhagavad Gita and think, okay, I've kind of cobbled together my own religion that helps me feel good. In fact, a few years ago, there was some research being done, and the researchers met a nurse who had the name Sheila. And she came in and she said, "You know what, I am a believer in Sheilaism." She had started her own religion that appropriately she named after herself. And this is what she said. She said, "It's just my own little voice. It's just trying to love yourself and be gentle with yourself. You know, I guess take care of each other." This was her religion that she had picked and chosen from other religions just to feel good, be happy, and maybe help someone else along the way. And yet, how many of us would truly like to serve a God that is just like us? I mean, I think I'm a pretty good guy, but I don't want to serve a God that's just like me. I want to serve a God that's better than me. I want to serve a God that's more powerful than me, that's more perfect than I could ever hope to be. I don't want to make God in my own image. I want to continue to be made in His. Grace is vanishing because Christians have not convinced the world that God's grace is the best thing there is. And yet, from time to time, the world does stop and recognize the importance and the greatness of God's grace. In times of national crises like September 11 or other big events that kind of shake us in our sense of security, media outlets, media icons like the New York Times will open up its pages to rabbis and pastors for them to write articles that will give people hope. These editorial pages aren't filled by atheists. They're not filled by evolutionary psychologists because they know that they have no hope to offer at these times. They know that they have no bigger picture to present. Whereas people like us, Christians, believers, we know that despite the bad things that might happen to us in this life, there is a bigger picture. There is something more out there. There is something better. And that is the grace of God. Paul writes to the Christians in Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 4:16. He says, "That is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day." He says, as Christians, we know that death is going to come. We know that there's no everlasting life here on this earth, that bad things are going to happen to us, but we don't give up. We keep on going because we have a belief in something bigger. We have a hope of something better. We have a conviction that God's grace is in this world, that is in our lives, and that is the best thing that there can be. And that is why we don't give up. And that is why we tell the world about God's grace, that there is something better for them, and not just when it comes to death, but when it comes to the day-to-day living. Because Christ offers salvation to all of us. And this is the good news of God's grace, that there is no limit to God's grace. That salvation is offered to everyone, including the losers. The people who are out of shape, those that aren't rich, those that aren't famous. Grace is for us all. It doesn't matter what the world thinks of us. It doesn't matter if we've checked all the boxes on the world's checklist or we've checked none of them. God still offers His grace to you and to me. Philip Yancey says, "The good news of the gospel means that every one of us can have the sense of destiny, a part to play in God's great story. We are more than a collection of neurons, more than an organism directed by the script of selfish genes." That is God's grace. Friends, this morning, there is nothing better than the grace of God. And yet, it is vanishing in this world because people have not been convinced, because people think that there is something else out there that is better than the grace that God offers to us. So the question for us then becomes, what are we going to do? Are you and I going to continue? Are we going to live lives that show the goodness and the greatness of God's grace? Are we as a church going to exist in a way that impacts our community for the better? This is what we are called to do, because it is only by truly living out the grace of God in our own lives that the world will stop and take notice. It is only by exuding the grace that God has filled your life with and my life with that we can truly work to stop God's grace from vanishing.